All right, this lesson is going to cover Michael Walzer's article, "The Distribution of Membership," and it's also going to kick off a new unit on immigration, which is really just since it's a summer semester class and there's only 8 weeks. We're just going to cover 2 readings in this unit, but there's a lot more in both the GJSE and the GESE volumes, and there's other resources on the internet as well on immigration. There's a lot that's been written by philosophers on this topic. I placed this unit right after the one on patriotism, and then as well as a debate about kind of particularism, embedded cells, views of ethics versus kind of philosophical liberal views, because I think they kind of connect to each other in various ways, which we will kind of see throughout this article and the next. And it's also, of course, it's a hot topic for our times. There was a recent Supreme Court decision concerning immigration that, like every other Supreme Court decision and every other political decision in general based on immigration, has divided people. Or at least there's divided opinions on it. Strongly held opinions, but they're divided. There doesn't seem to be much consensus. There's a lot that can be said about it. Let's just dive right into it, though. So Michael Walzer is a contemporary philosopher, and I'm embarrassed to admit this, but I don't know if he's alive or not yet, or if he's just recently passed away. You can Google that and find out yourself. Doesn't matter if he's alive or dead, though. Let's get to his argument. So, here's the main thesis. Walzer, in this article that you read, defends what philosophers and logicians call a disjunction. That's an either-or statement. So he defends the truth that this disjunction that we're about to see is true. Either one, every new immigrant, refugee, resident, and worker, etc., must be offered the opportunities of citizenship, or if a community is so divided that a single citizenship is impossible, then its territory must be divided. So that's basically saying either you offer everyone citizenship or you just divide it. There's no third option according to Walzer. So I'm not sure. I wish I could take polls. I guess I could, but I wonder. I think people might disagree with that. I think a lot. So of course he's going to need to defend it. Some people think, well, no, we don't have to divide our territory, and we don't have to grant these people citizenship. We could just keep them out to begin with. Well, perhaps that's an option in logical space. I'm not saying it's one that I agree with, but I'm saying I'm not saying I don't agree with it either. I'm just saying it's an option in logical space. Few of the things to pay attention to, though. 1, every new immigrant. He doesn't say every new legal or illegal immigrant. He just says every new immigrant. I wonder if that's purposely vague. Refugee, which is not the same thing as an immigrant. Resident, worker, etc. Must be offered the opportunities of citizenship. Okay. He introduces his argument by way of this fictional country called Fredonia. Fredonia is a capitalist democracy and welfare state with strong trade unions and a fairly affluent population. So it's, in some senses, a lot like the United States. It's also like Europe, Western Europe especially. In fact, as we go through this list, we're going to see that it's a lot like Western Europe, kind of in the 70s and 80s and 90s, but it was a specific time period. He was writing this article kind of in response to actually not what Americans are going to do with immigrants, but instead with what Western Europeans were going to do. So too, the owners and managers of Fredonia find it increasingly difficult to attract workers to a set of jobs that are or have come to be regarded as exhausting, dangerous, degrading, and dirty. And again, that's partially a problem here. There's a lot of agricultural labor jobs here, especially, that citizen workers in the United States just aren't drawn to. But we've had no problem finding workers for this from Central American countries. The context in Europe, which is more what Walzer had in mind, though, was, I guess, mining, lots of jobs. I don't know. And it was actually workers from Eastern Europe, as well as from North Africa, and from some Middle Eastern countries. So this is a kind of the fictional abstract story, but it applies to 2 different recent contexts. And I'm sure in 200 years, if what they're saying is right, and China is kind of the next world superpower, is China will be dealing with a similar problem with immigrants from other parts of Asia, for example. So it's just whatever countries or parts of the world tend to be the most affluent tend to just have this, well, not problem, but have this situation. It's a labor shortage. So it's worth doing some moral philosophizing about. And he notes lastly that these are socially necessary jobs. Someone must be found to do them. All right. So, well, going back to this, I couldn't find a video clip, but if anyone's ever seen Office Space, the movie, it was a cult classic from the late 90s. They talk about this question, what would you do for $1 million? And, you know, everyone's like, oh, I'd just go fishing all the time or go to the beach. At one point in the movie, this character, Michael Bolton, and I couldn't find a video clip of this, says, the question is bullshit. Because if everyone got to do what they wanted, then no one would do like janitorial work, because no one would want to mop that kind of stuff up. I'm not quoting it exactly, but the point is that there are jobs like janitorial work, certain types of agricultural jobs that, for the time being, because we don't have robots doing them, they're necessary. But at the same time, who wants to do them? And I'm sure a lot of you had jobs like this in high school. The types of jobs that can these places are able to stay in business because their labor force is high school students who aren't, you know, gonna be able to be eligible for any other type of employment. Okay, so Walzer's gonna note two solutions, two domestic alternatives for dealing with this socially necessary but non-wanted jobs. Alternative one is what I call the Rush solution, after Rush Limbaugh. The constraints imposed on the labor market by the unions and the welfare state should be broken. And then the most vulnerable segment of the local working class would be driven to accept those jobs that they hitherto thought were undesirable. So you get rid of unions, you get rid of labor regulations, you get rid of the minimum wage, you get rid of this whole idea of like a 9-to-5 workday, weekends off, child labor laws, get rid of all that stuff, like the ultimate free market solution. So I guess libertarians might like this as well. Libertarians, free market capitalists, basically remove all restrictions on the market. And then the local working class, who have been used to, you know, having weekends off, it needs to be time making a minimum wage at least, giving vacation time, will have no choice but to take these jobs. I mean, what else are they gonna do? Okay, so that's the Rush solution. Problem. This is the problem that Michael Walzer raises. And I say this is the early 1900s called and want their unsafe labor conditions back. Where it says what? That should say want. My bad. But this, according to Walzer, would require a dangerous and difficult political campaign. So that's a picture of kid factory workers in the early 1900s. So there are kids, your little brothers and sisters' ages, if you have little brothers and sisters that are like 10 or 8, that used to work in conditions that most grown-ups today in the United States would refuse to work in. 7 days a week, long days. So I guess Walzer's point is that this solution would kind of be going back to that. And the only way you could possibly justify that would be get some crazy politicians to campaign for it. Okay.
That's married.
The second alternative, what I call the more solution, maybe that's more promising. So this is another one that Walzer presents. This is where the wages and working conditions of the undesirable jobs could be just dramatically improved, so as to attract workers even within the constraints of the local market. So instead of removing all regulations, and, you know, the only reason people would take these jobs because they have no other choice, instead we'll make these jobs super desirable. So the working conditions will improve, the salaries will improve, the benefits will improve. Who wouldn't want to have these jobs after that? And the way you do this is by constraining the local market. So it's the opposite of the free market solution. It's a very, very restricted market. Well, Walzer finds a problem with this as well. I call this the Detroiting of America. This would raise costs throughout the economy and also challenge existing social hierarchy. So it just doesn't seem to be like a feasible option, according to Walzer. Okay, well, he proposes a third solution. So this is what we call the international solution. So Walzer says the first two ideas have problems. Either historically they haven't worked out too well, or we can just think of ways where it's very obvious that they wouldn't work out too well. So here's his solution. Rather than adopt either of these drastic measures, the owners and managers, with the help of the Fredonian government, shift the jobs from the domestic to the international labor market, making them available to workers in poorer countries for whom they are less undesirable. Okay, so guest worker program. We'll recruit workers from outside the country. And these jobs would be more desirable to them compared to whatever conditions they have in their current country. So, boom. Okay. Well, it would be crucial that these workers who are admitted would be guests rather than immigrants seeking a new home and a new citizenship. They'd just be there for a temporary amount of time, okay?
Ma chère mademoiselle, it is with deepest pride and greatest pleasure that we welcome you tonight. And now, we invite you to relax, just pull up a chair, as the dining room proudly presents your dinner. Be our guest. Be our guest. Put our service to the test. Tie your napkin round your neck, chérie, and we provide the rest.
Or not. So, according to Walzer, if these persons come as future citizens, not merely having a guest status then, but like with the assumption that they would become future citizens, then, well, detractors might say that they would temporarily occupy Fredonia's lower ranks, but then, benefiting from unions and welfare programs, they would eventually reproduce the original dilemma. So it's like that story of the guy pushing the rock up the hill, and then as soon as he gets to the top, the rock rolls back down again. It's just this, circle of misfortune. You think you solved the problem, but instead you just pushed it back, and it's going to emerge later. And that's the same problem according to these detractors. So further, if the guest workers, they would come into competition with local workers, some of whom they would outdo. In the United States, has experienced this problem in agriculture, especially with tomatoes. There was a problem in Alabama. Colbert Report actually had a lot of interesting segments on this, but we'll talk about that another time. Actually, that's something I talk about in the 16-week course, but unfortunately we don't have time. Hence, the regulations that govern their admission are designed to bar them from the protection of citizenship. We want them in to do their work and then get out. It's the most economically beneficial model for us, and perhaps it's economically beneficial for them, because whatever they do here and the wages they make will be better than what they would make in their original country of origin. So it's the guest worker program then. This is what's being pitched as an economic solution to Fredonia's problem, and this is what Michael Walzer is considering. These guest workers are brought in for a fixed time on contract to a particular employer, and they must leave when either they lose their job or their visas expire. They're usually young, in their 20s or 30s, and they're, only a minor drain on welfare services. And, oh yeah, one other thing. They have no political rights. So civil liberties that we enjoy, like free speech, assembly, association, are denied to these guest workers, either explicitly, by officials in law, or just implicitly. Like, yeah, you could, speak your mind, and you'll be deported. Or you'll be fired and then deported. So there's a distinction between what we'd say is de jure and de facto rights. De jure, de, Latin for of, and then de jure means law. So rights by law, and then de facto is just rights by fact. So we could have an official by law right to free speech, but then in fact, if you speak your mind, you could get fired, get sent back to your host country. So even though on the books you have a right, you in reality don't. You practice that right in reality, and you will suffer the consequences for it. So these either they would have no de jure rights, or they would have de jure rights, but de facto they wouldn't really have these rights. Sheriff Joe from Arizona would of course approve that. Okay, so these the question is, guest workers would be kind of like a permanent feature of Fredonia. Over time, it would become clear then that these guest workers are a permanent requirement of Fredonia's economy. So maybe some conditions would be eased, like they could get longer visas or bring their families with them. But unlike us, their residence would still be tied to employment, and loss of employment would result in deportation. So that threat of deportation is always looming overhead. Further, citizens of Fredonia who might be frightened by the influx of guest workers could put severe restrictions on where they can live and also import quotas. They could be shipped off to District 9. So, another factor is the living standards for these guest workers would be extremely low, especially compared to the rest of Fredonia, although perhaps higher than the standards of their host country. By the way, migrant workers in the United States actually do. So these are pictures of migrant worker homes in a farm in Michigan, taken recently. And so that's kind of an example of the living standards, and it's generally lower. Okay, so according to Walzer, what's hardest is their homelessness. They work long and hard in a country where they are strangers and not encouraged to settle down. They're deprived of normal social, sexual, and cultural activities for a fixed period of time. They send most of their money back to their guests, and money is really the only gain they get from this. Yet they're still very cheaply had by the members, the citizens of Fredonia, especially compared to the cost of raising and educating workers in Fredonia and paying what the labor market would require. It'd be vastly higher than what you pay guest workers. So, Fredonia comes out ahead because of this. So, now we're getting to Walzer's actual argument. So he's gonna make a normative claim about guest workers. It's gonna bear on the immigration debate today. He's gonna make a normative claim. He's gonna make a claim, and he's gonna try to argue for it. And we're gonna look at that argument that he gives for it. All this talk about Fredonia has been set up for it. So, first approximation. Keep in mind, Fredonia is a political community. So the first approximation by defenders of the guest worker system. This is how we defend these guest workers not getting the full rights of citizenship, not getting the opportunity to become citizens, justifying all the conditions of these guest workers that we saw in these previous slides. How can we justify that? Give a moral defense for it. So Walzer's going to look at one attempt at a moral defense of it. Fredonia is like a neighborhood, economically, and it's like a club or family politically. So, as a place to live, it's open to anyone who can find work. As a form or assembly or nation or people, it is closed except to those who meet the requirements set by the present members. So, the market for guest workers is not free of all political constraints. Without the non-denial of political rights and civil liberties and the ever-present threat of deportation, the system would not work. Hence, the guest workers are also subjects ruled by a band of citizen tyrants. So, Walzer finds issue with this. Mainly, tyrants aren't good. The guest workers being treated like a group of enemies ruled by tyrants then would be bad. That's an argument against this. And why is it like being ruled by citizen tyrants? Well, it's because of the denial of political rights and civil liberties and the present threat of deportation. And that's ironic because the system depends on this for its very existence. So what kind of system depends on that? Well, a tyrannical system. A tyrannical system is a type of system that depends on what we just saw in this bullet point. Okay. Well, there's an objection to this first approximation. And Walzer's issue with it. Don't the guest workers agree to be ruled? That is, the guest workers choose to come, knowing roughly what to expect. Okay. Well, here's Walzer's response. This kind of consent, given at a single moment in time, while it was clearly sufficient to legitimize many market transactions, is not sufficient in the political realm. Political authority is the right to make decisions over periods of time, to change rules, to cope with emergencies. Therefore, political authority requires ongoing consent of its subjects. Its subjects are the men and women resident within the territory over which its rulemaking power extends. So, the guest workers are in the territory of Fredonia for a long period of time. They're subject to the authority for a long period of time. They make a one-time decision, but then, so it's like, but then this one-time decision results in them being ruled for an extended period of time. He's saying for the duration of their being under this ruling authority, it should be the duration of their consent, basically, but it's not. There's a discrepancy there. There's a difference. Their consent is a momentary thing, whereas the authority is an ongoing thing. And if their authority is going to be ongoing, their consent should be ongoing. I don't know how else to phrase that. It seems pretty obvious to me. All right. Well, another response. Guest workers are really free to come and go. So what if they make this one-time decision? They can always choose to leave. Walzer, you're missing the point. They can always choose to leave. They're treated maybe like indentured servants while they're here, but unlike indentured servants, they're not indented. They can leave. Indentured servants, if you've taken history classes, weren't free to do that. They were kind of just bound to it. So then if they come voluntarily and can leave voluntarily, why should they be granted political rights while they stay? Instead, guest workers should have no more rights than tourists. Okay, it's a pretty powerful objection. Well, Walzer's going to draw a disanalogy with tourists and guest workers, and he's going to make that, and he's going to use that disanalogy to respond to this response. So, where's the disanalogy between guest workers and tourists? After all, they're both there for a temporary amount of time. Well, unlike tourists, guest workers are workers. They come because they need to work, not just visiting, seeing, sightseeing. They're not on vacation. They're not spending their days as they please. Instead, they're doing really hard work. They experience the state as a pervasive and frightening power that shapes their lives and regulates their every move, unlike tourists, who, the state is like your big tour guide. As a group, they constitute a disenfranchised class. They are exploited and oppressed, usually because they're disenfranchised. They can't form unions or organize or anything like that. The fact that they can't form unions is something that we kind of count on. Their material condition is not likely to be changed unless their political status is changed. So until they get the right to unionize and other liberties, their material goods they have access to, their living conditions, and so on, etc., are just going to kind of plateau, stagnate, stale, static. Okay. So Walzer's he's going to argue that guests. Now he's not saying they need mutual aid. They're not destitute or injured or helpless. They're not like refugees. They're hard-working, able-bodied entities that are doing socially necessary work that we count on. So refugees, which is a different, we're going to be looking at that soon when we look at some articles by Peter Singer and some other philosophers. Refugees are different types of moral issues, and our obligations towards refugees are a different set of moral questions. So at this point, I'm just going to say that guest workers are not refugees. Economies don't typically depend on refugees. So economically speaking, refugees, or I don't like the word drain because it's not like they can help being refugees. They're running from war and famine. But the point is, economies don't benefit from refugees the way, and don't rely on, refugees aren't necessary for economies the way guest workers are necessary for the economy of Fredonia. They do socially necessary work. And therefore, they're in our legal system, whether or not they have legal rights, they're in our legal system. Okay. So, he's going to say they don't need, mutually, they don't need charity. They just need political rights. They need the right to organize and form unions and vote. Not saying those specific rights, but they need something like that, some type of political rights. And what Walzer specifically is going to argue is that they ought to regard themselves as potential or future participants in politics. They must have then basic civil liberties. Okay. He says the processes of self-determination through which a territorial state shapes its internal life must be open and equally open to all those men and women who live in the territory, work in the local economy, and are subject to local law. There cannot be a fixed status between citizen and foreigner, though there can be stages in the transition from one of these to the other, so it shouldn't be static again. So that's a bold claim, that it should be open. that he's working towards. So, does he have an argument for that? Yes, he does. So, recall the bold claim. Guest workers should have the right to eventually become citizens and have the full rights of citizenship. If you're going to make guest workers in your country, then you got to let them have the full rights of citizens. So that's a bold claim that he's been working his way towards. Does he have an argument? Yes, he does. Let me show you a bird's eye view. It's an 8-step argument. It's a pretty lengthy argument. We're going to walk through it one step at a time, although we've kind of already gone through this, so this is kind of just a rehash. So, the country of Fredonia, premise 1, has many socially necessary but undesirable jobs. Remember the office space point. We still need janitors. We still need people to do hard agricultural labor, tomato pickers. Premise 2, if the country of Fredonia, like the United States or Western Europe, has many socially necessary but undesirable jobs, then Fredonia must either find workers for those jobs domestically or internationally. Premise 3, it is not the case that Fredonia should find workers for those jobs domestically. Why? Remember the Rush Limbaugh solution and the Michael Moore solution and the problem with both? Well, that's why. Premise 4, so Fredonia should find workers for those jobs internationally, the guest worker idea. Premise 5, the international guest workers are subject to the full force of Fredonia's political authority. That's just a basic fact. If you're a guest in another country, you're subject to that country's political authority. Now, here's a brief aside. Man, in the olden days, I could lecture, and I didn't have to write stuff down, and students would just absorb it. I'm talking about the old days before even I was teaching. I'm talking about like in the 70s and 80s and 50s. But just the internet, it's just we receive information differently. So this soliloquy I'm about to go on, I wouldn't have needed to write it down. But now if I'm going to... But whatever, it's interesting. So guest workers isn't just restricted to like Western Europe and the United States, like Western countries, basically. So in the 1970s and 80s, when Saudi Arabia found out that they had large quantities of oil, which is obviously a very valuable commodity, and it's one of the reasons why Saudi Arabia is extremely economically affluent. Well, Saudi Arabia didn't have a labor force that was trained to handle basically the drilling of oil and the shipment and export of oil. It's just a complicated operation. So they had guest workers from the United States and Europe, and eventually from all over the world. So in the 80s, a lot of people in the oil industry, but then would go to Saudi Arabia and work for 1 to 3 years, basically helping them out. And in addition to that, we also needed doctors and teachers, and just a whole workforce kind of became guest workers in Saudi Arabia. Now these were not, there was, the difference between Saudi Arabia and Western Europe was this wasn't low wage work. They were typically making very high wages. In fact, you were bound to make a lot of money, which is why a lot of people did it. They were just making 6-figure incomes. But Saudi Arabia had heavy restrictions on these guest workers. So if you're an American in Saudi Arabia working in the oil industry, for example, not only did you need an entry visa, a visa to get into Saudi Arabia, if you wanted to leave and go back to the United States to visit family, you had to get what's called an exit visa. And your employer had to somehow get that through the Saudi government. So there was restrictions on travel, restrictions on what you could bring in, what you could possess, religious worship. So this isn't just a Western problem or a Western issue. This is it's shown up in other contexts. There's and the Americans in Saudi Arabia, for example, had virtually no political rights. I think that's still the case. But you know what? We still do business with them. We still have guest workers. We still do exports and so on. So it was worth the guest workers' while to do it in spite of the loss of political rights. That's just a brief aside. Okay. So, but the point is that you're subject to that political liberty of that country, the political authority. I'm sorry, not liberty. Premise 6. If the international guest workers are subject to the full force of Fredonia's political authority, then they must be given ultimately an equal say in what that authority does. That's the contentious premise 6. Premise 7. So basically, if you're going to be subject to an authority, you must have a say in that authority. That's what Walzer's arguing. Premise 7. The international guest workers can only be given an equal say in what that authority does, ultimately only if they are offered the opportunity to eventually become members. And then finally, conclusion 8. So, if Fredonia finds workers for the socially necessary but undesirable jobs internationally, then they must give those guest workers the opportunity to eventually become members. All right, brief point. The premise to challenge in this argument is premise 6, I think. So, if you don't like Walzer's conclusion, you can't just disagree with him. If you merely just don't like it, that doesn't matter. That's not philosophically interesting. If you wanted to challenge his argument, though, I'd say the premise to challenge would be premise 6, and you would have to come up with some reasons for why premise 6 is false. And to show that premise 6 is false, you have to show that the antecedent, so what's between the word if and then, is not connected to the consequent, the words after then, basically. So you have to challenge the link between one and the other. So that's where the philosophy comes in. So there are ways to challenge it, but I want you to figure that out. Okay, thank you.